Welcome to my first real video on this channel. I guess I'll just jump right into it and say that I'm making this to help the people who, similarly to me, have an AP test coming up in a couple of weeks and might want a little bit of last-minute study time, but maybe you've procrastinated a little bit too long and don't have enough time to study or do a full study session. So a recap video similar to this one is exactly what you need. Well, that's exactly what this is, a recap video. So just jumping right into it. What's important to understand about this time in history is that before the Europeans reached the Americas, Native American societies were diverse, complex, and overall vast. Many of them existed as hunter-gatherers. However, many more existed as in permanent settlements, relying on cultivation of maize, which is corn, fish, and a myriad of other food sources. They weren't just nomadic tribes. They were advanced societies that were overall ruined by coming European nations. But then the Europeans wanted some. So colonies are created. And the reasons that Europeans end up colonizing is typically motivated by a desire to create profit for their mother country. Now, this idea is a pretty common idea throughout history. It's known as mercantilism. And it causes a lot of frequent and, frankly, heavy, intense conflict over land between warring European colonists and the colonists and natives. Now, religious motives were also typically a strong reason for Europeans to set up colonies. So let's begin with the Columbian Exchange. This was, when the Europeans first made contact with the Americas, and it resulted in a very quick diffusion and exchange of goods, ideas, diseases, crops, and animals between the Old and New World. Now, the effects that this exchange had on the Americas or the New World were pretty extreme. So, first, it spread crops and livestock to the Americas. Pigs, chicken, horses, things that you take for granted as existing in America didn't always. It also brought the spread of diseases like smallpox and measles that resulted from diverse groups like Africans, Asians, and Europeans all mixing and mingling with each other in Eurasia before they headed over to the Americas. Third, it led to cultural exchanges that often led to cultural clashing. Now, this was seen with European ideas of ownership and private property, and when those would clash with indigenous ideas that things like resources and land were communal. The fourth impact that the Columbian Exchange had on the Americas was the introduction of African slaves to the Americas as a source of labor via the transatlantic slave trade. Conversely, this exchange had many, although frequently different, effects on the Old World, Europe, Africa, and Asia. So what it did there was it first spread new crops like corn and potatoes that were native to America to Europe, and this influx of new foods resulted in huge population increases. It also led to a shift towards capitalism as mercantilist ideas grew in popularity. Now that we've established the general exchange between the New World and the Old World once the contact was first made, it's best to look at the specific ways that specific European colonies interacted with the new continent. So first, we'll talk about Spain. Now, they established colonies in what is, in the modern day, Mexico, the Southwest United States, and Florida. Now, the Spanish colonized mainly to spread Catholicism through converting the natives and to create wealth. This was in support of the idea of mercantilism and executed through cash crops and the mining of gold and silver. However, obviously, it wasn't the Spanish themselves who were often working on these plantations or mining this silver. The labor that they used for these systems was largely Native Americans forced to work in these mines and plantations, while also being converted to Catholicism. This was called the encomienda system. To subject the native populations further, the Spanish developed the Las Castas system, which aimed to assimilate minority groups into Spanish culture. The next colony that's important to talk about is France. France established colonies in the modern-day Midwest and Canada. The French still colonized to create wealth and support mercantilism, but they sought to do it through trade specifically of furs. They also wanted to spread Catholicism to the natives, but did it in a much more peaceful way. This led to a more collaborative relationship with the natives, and it even led to missionaries and traders often intermarrying and living within Native American communities. The last of the non-British European colonies that are most important when we're talking about who colonized the Americas is the Dutch, who colonized what is the present-day East Coast region around New York. The Dutch mainly colonized to create wealth, also relying on the fur trade. They cared little about spreading their faith as well, so native populations and their relations with them were a lot more peaceful. Now that we've gotten those three, we move into the British colonies, which make up the United States as we know it today. The first and one of the most important of the British colonies is the New England colony, which consisted mostly of Puritans, located in modern-day Massachusetts. Now, the Puritans were primarily families fleeing religious persecution and aiming to establish a society of their own without persecution. The King of Britain at the time, King James I, was religiously intolerant and began to execute those who were both not Catholic and critical of his ways, making the Puritans a prime target. Within their established society, their economy consisted of family farms as well as the trade of fish and lumber into the triangular trade, which we'll get to a little bit later. Puritan societies were largely religiously intolerant, only accepting Puritanism as a faith within their society. Their societies were largely patriarchal, and their relationship with natives was hostile, often stealing land from them and leading to a variety of wars. The next British colony that we'll talk about was the Chesapeake Bay Colony, which is located in Virginia and Maryland. The colony was a joint stock company, which allowed investors to create wealth from the colony. In order to create this wealth, the colony relied heavily on a cash crop agriculture, specifically the growth of tobacco. Indentured servants did most of the labor on these plantations, and these servants signed a contract where, in exchange for their labor in the Chesapeake Bay Colony for 7 years, they would receive passage from England as well as land in the Americas. This led to a trend of taking land from the natives to give to the indentured servants, which obviously caused a lot of tension. Natives fought back, upsetting the colonists and leading to Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion was when a group of former indentured servants formed a militia, attacking the nearby natives before turning around and attacking Jamestown itself, burning it to the ground. After this event, the colony stopped relying on indentured servitude, wonder why, and instead imported African slaves for labor. The next of these colonies is the Middle Colonies, which are located in modern-day Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New York. They matter very little, so I'll try to breeze through it. They were a community of Quakers, mostly. They were established to accrue wealth, and they made wealth through commercial trade of oats, corn, wheat, etc., grains. They were religiously tolerant and overall peaceful with the Native Americans, obviously breaking the trend of the British colonies so far. The final British colony that we'll look at is the Deep South colonies. These were located in modern-day Georgia and the Carolinas, and they sought to accrue wealth through cash crop plantations of rice and sugarcane that they obviously sold in the triangular trade for a profit. For plantation labor, they relied on African slaves to such an extent that Africans were in fact the majority population in the Deep South. This led to a revolt known as the Stono Rebellion in 1739. During the Stono Rebellion, dozens of white enslavers were killed by rebelling slaves, which served him right. And so that summarizes the main colonies that consisted in the Americas. You've got the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, and then for the British colonies, there is the New England colony, the Chesapeake Bay colony, the Middle colonies, and the Deep South colonies. As long as you remember all of those colonies, you'll be really set for period 1 and period 2 review. Now that we've, established that these colonies existed and their motivations, we'll take a look at how these colonies actually were run. And so it's best to first look at the British rule of the colonies at the time and the general economy that the colonies relied on. So these British colonies all helped to form what is known as the triangular trade, which is a trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. And this helped create wealth from the American colonies. In an effort to create more wealth for the mother country, Britain established trading rules for its colonies known as the Navigation Acts. This stated that American merchants could only sell to Britain and that American ships must pass through British ports where they were taxed. American merchants largely ignored these rules and were kind of upset by them because why would you want to be taxed? However, Britain largely didn't care because it had a policy of salutary neglect at the time. This meant that the British had an overall relaxed oversight on the American colonies, and it lasted all the way until the 7 Years' War. At this point, it's important to address the culture of the colonies. And so, first, we'll talk about the Enlightenment, an intellectual movement from Europe that emphasized reason over tradition. This spread ideas of natural rights and popular sovereignty to the colonies, emphasizing the idea that government should serve the people and serving as a base for American independence. Now, in response to what came from the Enlightenment was the First Great Awakening. This was a major revival of Christian movements that quickly took over the colonies. This movement was spearheaded by Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, two preachers who immigrated to the colonies from Britain. This movement consisted of 3 core beliefs. The first was the idea that all people were born sinners, but could be saved from hell should they confess to their sins. The second was the idea that emotion was more important than reason. And the third was the idea that authority must be challenged, leading to a diversity of Protestant Christians. They were no longer a monolith. On top of this, the colonies were falling into Anglicization, which meant that their culture was becoming more British. Overall, these 3 movements culminated to form the beginnings of an American culture. They laid the groundwork for the American Revolution, and you can see their impacts in America today. And so that really summarizes what periods 1 and 2 of American history are all about. It'll move into the American Revolution and what really sparked that other than what we just talked about. Hopefully this has helped you in some way or another, and hopefully you'll be more prepared for your AP test.